Send her. Vivian Whitfield's voice cut through the parlor like a blade. Send Eleanor instead. One heartbeat of silence, then the room erupted in laughter. Eleanor stood in the doorway, holding the letter meant for her beautiful sister, feeling every cruel sound land against her scarred face like open hands. They were sending her to Montana as a joke, a punishment for a wealthy rancher presumptuous enough to reach above his station. She was the ugly one, the disposable one, the daughter nobody wanted. Eleanor looked down at the train ticket in her trembling hands and made the only decision that would change everything. Before we go any further, if you've ever been counted out by the people who were supposed to love you, this story was written for your heart. Subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The ticket was real. Eleanor had turned it over 3 times, read the destination twice, pressed her thumb against the printed ink as if she could feel the truth through the paper itself. Silver Creek Valley, Montana Territory. Departure Friday morning, 6 o'clock. 1 passenger, one way. Her name was written on it. Not Clara's. Not her stepmother's beautiful blonde, socially acceptable Clara, the daughter people praised at church socials, the daughter men tipped their hats toward on Main Street, the daughter whose laugh made rooms feel warmer just by entering them. No, the name on the ticket was Eleanor Margaret Whitfield. The other one. You can't be serious, Eleanor said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, which surprised her, because inside her chest there was something collapsing slowly, the way a barn roof caves under winter snow, one rafter at a time. Her stepmother, Vivian Whitfield, still beautiful at 50, still dressed as though she expected to be admired from across a room, tilted her head, with that practiced elegance that Eleanor had spent 27 years watching, and never once being able to imitate. I'm perfectly serious, darling. The word darling landed the way it always did, wrapped in silk and full of teeth. Mr. Carter sent his letter requesting a Whitfield woman. You are a Whitfield woman. The arrangement stands. He sent for Clara. Clara isn't available. Eleanor set the ticket down on the side table. Carefully, the way you set down something you don't trust yourself to hold. Clara refused him. Yes. Vivian examined her own reflection in the mirror above the mantelpiece with brief, satisfied attention. So the responsibility falls to you. From across the room, Eleanor heard it, the first sound she recognized before she consciously processed its meaning. Laughter, quiet at first, almost swallowed, but then Margaret, her stepsister, let it out fully, and then William, Margaret's husband, who had no business being in this conversation at all, joined in, and then even the housemaid, Dottie, who had the decency to cover her mouth, could not fully suppress the sound rising in her throat. They were laughing. They were laughing because the idea of Eleanor Whitfield being sent as a mail-order bride was, to every person in that room, fundamentally ridiculous. Eleanor knew why. She had known why for 27 years. She reached up with her left hand and pressed her palm flat against the right side of her face, against the scar that began just below her cheekbone and stretched down in a pale, uneven line toward the edge of her jaw. She'd had it since she was 4 years old. A fire in the kitchen, a stumble, a split second that had rearranged the entire story of her life before she was old enough to understand she was living one. The skin there was smooth in the wrong way, tighter than it should have been, puckered at one end, slightly pulling the corner of her eye downward, so that in certain light, in certain company, people would look at her, and then look away quickly, embarrassed on her behalf. She had stopped being embarrassed by it herself, somewhere around age 12. She had not, however, stopped being aware of exactly what it meant to other people. It meant she was unmarriageable. It meant she was the family's private disappointment, the one they presented when necessary and kept hidden when possible. It meant that her stepmother was not sending her to Montana because she believed Eleanor deserved a chance at a life. She was sending her as a punishment for Nathaniel Carter. He wrote asking for a refined Eastern woman, Vivian continued, smoothing the front of her dress with one hand. A companion, someone educated, someone who can manage a household. She paused. You can manage a household. You're not doing this for me. Of course not. Vivian said it pleasantly, as though Eleanor had observed that the weather was mild. "I'm doing it because Mr. Carter's letter was, frankly, presumptuous. A cattle rancher in Montana Territory sending correspondence to a family of our standing, as if he deserves the pick of our daughters." Her chin lifted. "He'll receive what he deserves. He'll receive me," Eleanor said. "Yes," Vivian agreed, and the smile returned, thin and sharp as a letter opener. "He will." The laughter in the room had not entirely stopped. Eleanor looked at the ticket again. She thought about every morning she had woken up in this house and felt the weight of everyone else's low expectations pressing down on her before she'd even opened her eyes. She thought about the way people looked at her scar and then looked at everything else in the room with sudden, urgent interest. She thought about Clara, who had refused this opportunity without a second's hesitation, who had laughed along with everyone else at the very suggestion that a man of any consequence could want Eleanor for a wife. She picked up the ticket. She folded it once along the center crease. "Then I'll go," she said. The laughter stopped. Vivian turned to look at her with something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. "I beg your pardon?" I said. "I'll go." Eleanor tucked the ticket into the pocket of her day dress. "Friday morning, 6 o'clock. I'll be on the platform." "Eleanor, this is what you wanted, isn't it?" She looked at her stepmother directly, and she watched Vivian's composure flicker for just one moment, one tiny honest moment before it resettled into its usual composed arrangement. "You wanted me gone. You wanted a man to look at me and be humiliated, and then you wanted to tell everyone in Providence exactly what happened, how far the ugliest Whitfield girl fell, what a fool that rancher was for ever sending for any of us." She paused. "Go ahead and plan your story. I'm going to go live mine." She left the parlor before anyone found words. She climbed the stairs to her room, closed the door, and stood in the quiet for exactly 30 seconds before she allowed herself to sit down on the edge of her bed and press both hands against her knees to stop them shaking. She was terrified. She was also, for the first time in years, absolutely certain she was making the right decision. The preparations took 4 days. Eleanor packed with a precision that was, in itself, a kind of defiance. She brought her practical dresses first, the ones she could actually work in, not the decorative things Vivian had occasionally forced her into for social occasions where Eleanor stood at the edges of rooms and waited for the evening to end. She brought her father's accounting ledgers, which she had studied so thoroughly after his death that she could quote figures from 3 years back without opening the cover. She brought her medical reference book, her 2 novels, her grandmother's recipe collection, written in fade pencil, across 37 folded pages. She did not bring her hope. She had misplaced that some time ago. She did pack something she rarely showed anyone. Folded between the pages of the accounting ledger were 11 letters. Nathaniel Carter's letters, the original ones, that had arrived addressed to the household, written over the course of 6 months. Her stepmother had intended for Clara to respond to them. Clara had read the first 2 and lost interest. The remaining 9 had sat unopened on the secretary desk in the front hall, and Eleanor, who sorted the mail, who organized everything in that house the way furniture gets arranged in a room, no one lives in useful but unnoticed, had read all of them. She had read them more than once. Nathaniel Carter wrote about his land the way some men wrote about their children, with love that had nowhere else to go. He wrote about Silver Creek Valley in winter, about the way the cold was different there than anywhere he'd ever been then, cleaner somehow, sharper. He wrote about his workers by name, about the problems on the ranch, about the loneliness of success without someone to share it with. His sentences were not elegant. He crossed out words. He started paragraphs over. His grammar was sometimes imprecise. But the letters were real in a way that Eleanor had rarely encountered in the polished drawing rooms of Providence, where men said beautiful things that meant absolutely nothing. She read the 11th letter again on the train, the one he'd written most recently, the one where he'd finally asked directly, "I don't know how to say this without sounding foolish, but I'm not looking for someone perfect. I'm looking for someone real. Someone who doesn't mind hard work and hard winters, and the kind of life that doesn't have much room for pretending. I hope that's enough to tempt someone to try." Eleanor folded the letter and put it in her dress pocket and looked out the window at a landscape growing wilder and more open with every passing hour. She thought, I don't mind any of those things. She thought, he doesn't know what he's asking for. She thought, neither do I. The journey was 4 days. She slept poorly, ate what was available, declined conversation from the women in the passenger car, who looked at her scar with the quick, involuntary curiosity she had catalogued over the years into categories: the startled look, the pitying look, the determined not to look, the children's honest stare that was somehow the easiest to handle because it was at least uncomplicated. By the 3rd day she had stopped minding. By the 4th she had started wondering what kind of man she was traveling toward. The station at Silver Creek Valley was smaller than she'd expected, and louder. The sound of livestock nearby, the smell of pine, and something she couldn't name, the quality of the light different from Providence's careful eastern diffidence, broader somehow, less apologetic. She stepped down onto the platform with her bag, and stood for a moment, absorbing it. That was when she saw him. He was taller than she'd imagined. She didn't know why she'd imagined anything at all. But she had, in the way you build a person out of their written words and hope the construction is close. Nathaniel Carter was perhaps 35, dark-haired, weathered in the particular way of men who spent most of their lives outdoors. With working hands and a set to his jaw that suggested he'd learned not to waste energy on things that couldn't be changed. He was looking at the platform with a kind of careful attention that told her he was nervous, though he was holding it well. He hadn't seen her yet. Eleanor stood still for one breath. She was aware of herself completely in that moment, the scar on her face, the plainness of her dress, the 27 years of other people's verdicts about what she was and was not worth. She was aware of why she had been sent here, and what was supposed to happen next. She walked toward him. He turned. His eyes found her face, and she watched because she was practiced at watching, at cataloging, at reading the small movements that preceded the larger ones. She watched for the thing that always came. The flicker. The recalibration. The moment where a person's expression rearranged itself from whatever it had been into something managed, something careful. It came. Of course it came, but it passed faster than she expected. Miss Whitfield. His voice was lower than she'd imagined from the letters, and he was looking at her directly now, not at her scar specifically, not performing the looking away, simply looking at her the way he might look at a problem he was trying to understand. Yes, she said. I'm Eleanor Whitfield. He took off his hat. I'm Nathaniel Carter. A pause stretched between them, the kind that could have gone badly in a dozen different directions. I don't know what they told you about my ranch, he said. Or about me. I expect not all of it was accurate. They didn't tell me much, Eleanor said. I read your letters. Something shifted in his expression. All of them? All 11. He looked at her for a moment. Then you know more about me than most people do. I know what you were willing to write down, she said. Which might be the same thing. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite there, but it was close. I arranged a room at the boarding house for tonight, he said. I thought we could talk, properly, before anything else is decided. Before you decide whether to send me back, Eleanor said, not unkindly. He was quiet for a moment, before either of us decides anything. Eleanor picked up her bag. Then we should talk, she said. She did not tell him why she had really been sent. Not yet. She wasn't sure if the honesty would help or harm her, and she had learned over a lifetime of being underestimated that timing was everything, not for manipulation, but for survival. There were things you said when someone was ready to hear them, and things that landed wrong, not because they were untrue, but because the ground wasn't prepared. The boarding house dinner was awkward in the way that first real conversations always are, when two people are simultaneously evaluating each other and trying to appear as though they aren't. The proprietress, Mrs. Alderman, a round-faced woman of 60, with the direct manner of someone who had long since stopped caring about social diplomacy, set food in front of them and left without comment, which Eleanor appreciated. Nathaniel asked her about Providence. She answered honestly that it was a city of considerable elegance and very little warmth in her experience. She did not elaborate on the specific experience. He didn't push. She asked about the ranch. He lit up. It was, Eleanor thought, the most revealing thing about a person what made them forget to perform composure. Nathaniel Carter, who had held himself with careful self-possession since she'd stepped off the train, started talking about his cattle operation with an animation that rewrote his entire face. He talked about the winter losses they'd sustained 2 years back and the adjustments he'd made. He talked about the creek that ran through the northeast quarter of the property and the problem with the eastern fence line. He talked about his foreman, a man called Harris who'd been with him for 11 years, and who Nathaniel plainly regarded with the particular warm frustration of long association. Eleanor asked specific questions. Nathaniel stopped once, mid-sentence, and looked at her. "You understand what I'm describing," he said, not accusatory. Surprised. "My father owned a textile mill and 2 properties," Eleanor said. "After he died, I managed the records for 3 years before my stepmother sold everything. I understand accounts and operations. Your stepmother sold everything?" "She didn't find them interesting." Eleanor paused. "I did." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why are you here, Miss Whitfield?" She decided, then, that the ground was prepared enough. "Because my stepmother sent me as a punishment," she said. "She believed you would reject me immediately. She thought it would be embarrassing for you and useful for her." A story to tell. The silence afterward was absolute. Nathaniel's expression didn't change quickly. He was a man who processed things carefully. She was beginning to understand, not slow, but deliberate, the way you handle something you don't want to drop. "And you came anyway," he said finally. "I came because I wanted to leave that house," Eleanor said. "And because I read your letters. And because you wrote that you weren't looking for someone perfect." She met his eyes. "I'm not perfect, Mr. Carter. I suspect you've gathered that. But I'm real, and I'm a hard worker, and I won't pretend to be something I'm not." He was quiet for a long time, then he said, "Neither will I." They sat with that. "What do you want?" he asked. "If you could have decided this for yourself, what would you have wanted?" Nobody had ever asked her that. The question landed somewhere in her chest and stayed. "To be useful," she said, after a moment. "To build something that matters. To be seen." She paused. Actually seen, not looked at and looked away from. He nodded slowly. "Can I show you the ranch tomorrow?" he said. "Not to decide anything, just so you can see it." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Good." He stood, took his hat from the table. "I'm glad you came, Miss Whitfield. I don't know yet what any of this means, but I'm glad you came." He left. Eleanor sat for a moment in the empty dining room and felt something unfamiliar settling in her chest. Not hope exactly, she didn't trust hope, but possibility. The possibility that she had been sent here to be broken, and was about to become something else entirely. Outside the boarding house window, Silver Creek Valley stretched in the blue dark of a Montana evening, and it was enormous and wild, and it didn't know or care who Eleanor Whitfield was. That was, she realized, exactly what she had needed. She finished her tea. She climbed the stairs to her room. And for the first time in 27 years, she fell asleep without dreading the morning. The ranch revealed itself to her the next day in layers. First, the scale of it, far larger than she had visualized from the letters, which had described acreage in numbers she knew intellectually, but hadn't translated into physical reality, until she was standing on the eastern hill and could see the property stretching in every direction farther than felt reasonable for one man to hold. Then, the work of it. Harris, the foreman, was a lean man in his 50s with sun-creased skin and the particular economy of movement that came from decades of physical labor. He shook Eleanor's hand once, looked at her face without flinching, and said, "You know anything about cattle?" "Not yet," Eleanor said. "Honest answer," Harris said, and seemed to approve of it. The workers were more varied in their reactions. Some were simply curious. A few were wary. She caught the looks exchanged, the quick assessments, the silent calculations happening behind careful expressions. One young hand, a boy of perhaps 19 named Billy, stared at her scar with completely unguarded fascination until an older worker elbowed him into looking elsewhere. Eleanor chose not to notice, or rather, she chose to file it and continue. What she did notice, 3 things that didn't add up in the operation. The feed storage arrangement was inefficient, the wrong inventory rotated incorrectly, which meant certain stores were aging past usefulness while fresh stock accumulated. She said nothing about this yet. She watched. The bunkhouse roster had a gap she didn't understand. 7 men signed on for wages, but only 5 consistently present. She asked Harris about it quietly, and his expression shifted in a way that told her it was complicated. "Those 2 went to Whitmore's operation," he said shortly. 6 weeks back. Nathaniel knows. He knows they left. He doesn't know they left specifically for Whitmore. Harris looked at her with something that was partly assessing, and partly, she thought, asking a question he hadn't voiced. "Who's Whitmore?" Eleanor asked. Harris was quiet for a moment. "Then, Charles Whitmore owns the property east of here. Largest spread in the valley after Carter land. He and Mr. Carter have been civil, mostly, Eleanor repeated. "There's some history," Harris said, "and Whitmore's been expanding." Quietly, "Some of the smaller ranches sold to him last year. People who ran into trouble." He paused. "Funny how some of them ran into trouble." Eleanor looked at him. "You're saying the trouble wasn't entirely accidental?" Harris didn't answer, which was itself an answer. She absorbed that and stored it. By the end of the first week, Eleanor understood the ranch in outline. By the end of the second, she understood its pressure points, where it was strong, where it was fragile, where decisions made several years back had created problems that hadn't fully matured yet. She didn't volunteer all of this. She wasn't sure of her position. She was in the strange suspended state of a person who has arrived at a destination without yet knowing whether they'll be staying, a guest, a possibility, something without a clear name. But she couldn't not see the problems once she saw them. And Nathaniel, she was beginning to understand, noticed that she saw them. He would find her in the late afternoons reviewing the supply ledgers she'd asked permission to examine, and he'd come to stand nearby, not demanding but present, and eventually he would ask a question and she would answer it, and they would, almost without deciding to, spend an hour talking through the numbers. He was intelligent. She had known that from the letters, but intelligence on paper and intelligence in practice were different things. And his was the practical kind. He understood systems, saw connections between decisions and outcomes, could hold many variables simultaneously. What he lacked, she was beginning to see, was the specific kind of organizational knowledge that came from years of studying ledgers and accounts in formal detail. She had that. He had the land and the vision. Between them, she thought very quietly, not quite allowing herself to fully think it yet, between them, they might have something functional. Then Charles Whitmore came to dinner. Nathaniel had warned her. "He'll be here Friday. He comes by occasionally, business conversation mostly. He can be." A pause. "You don't have to join us." "I'd like to," Eleanor said. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. "He can be unpleasant." "I've had practice with unpleasant," she said. Whitmore arrived the way certain men arrived, loudly, with an assumed right to space, speaking before he was fully through the door. He was handsome, in the expensively maintained way of men who've never had to choose between appearance and survival, with a smile that showed too many teeth and settled on people in a way Eleanor recognized immediately, the smile of a man who was always calculating. He saw Eleanor. The smile didn't change. That was how she knew it was never real. "Well," he said to Nathaniel, "this must be the Eastern woman." "Miss Eleanor Whitfield," Nathaniel said. "Eleanor, this is Charles Whitmore." "Miss Whitfield." Whitmore looked at her, directly at her scar specifically, for precisely long enough to let her know he'd noted it, and then at Nathaniel, with an expression that managed to communicate both sympathy and contempt simultaneously. "Quite a journey from Providence." "Not so bad," Eleanor said. The train was comfortable. Dinner was a careful performance. Whitmore talked about cattle prices and territory politics and the general difficulty of maintaining operations of serious scale, all of which were ostensibly neutral topics aimed specifically, Eleanor felt, at reminding Nathaniel of his own precarious position. He was probing, testing, looking for the edges of a boundary. At one point he said, addressing Eleanor directly, "Your family, the Providence Whitfields? Manufacturing?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "Successful operation?" "My father was successful. The operation was sold after his death." "Ah." Whitmore nodded with the particular manner of a man collecting information he'll use later. And you came all this way to help on a cattle ranch. He let the pause do the work. Admirable. I came because the opportunity interested me, Eleanor said. What specifically interested you? She looked at him. The scale, the challenge, the possibility of contributing to something that matters. She paused. Not everyone measures opportunity by elegance, Mr. Whitmore. Nathaniel made a small sound that might in different company have been a laugh. Whitmore's smile held. When he left that night, he shook Nathaniel's hand at the door and said, just at the threshold, just loud enough for Eleanor to hear, Carter. I hope you know what you're doing. He didn't look at Eleanor when he said it. He didn't need to. Nathaniel closed the door. He turned. Eleanor was standing at the far end of the room, and she said, he's not here because of business. No, Nathaniel agreed, he's watching this place. Watching for instability. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He made an offer last spring, for the North Quarter. I declined. Did he accept the answer? He said he did. Nathaniel looked toward the closed door with an expression she was learning to read, the particular flatness that meant he was controlling something he didn't want visible. But Whitmore doesn't accept things easily, no, Eleanor said. He doesn't. They looked at each other across the room. There were things neither of them had said yet, about what was happening between them, about what this arrangement was or wasn't, about what either of them wanted, about the gap between the practical and the personal, that they'd been carefully, almost conspiratorially, not crossing. But in that moment, standing in the quiet of the ranch house with the sound of Montana wind against the windows, Eleanor felt it, the shift. The thing that happens when two people stop performing their careful individual composure and simply occupy the same reality at the same time. Nathaniel said, I'm glad you came, Eleanor. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She felt it land. So am I, she said, and meant it. Outside, somewhere in the dark distance, something moved on the Carter land. Something that Charles Whitmore had set in motion before dinner, before his careful smiling conversation. Before his deliberate look at Eleanor's face had communicated everything he'd intended it to communicate. Something was coming. Eleanor didn't know it yet, but she was about to find out exactly what she was made of. And so was Nathaniel Carter. The morning after Whitmore's visit, Eleanor was already at the supply ledgers before sunrise. She hadn't slept well. Not because of fear. She had moved past fear somewhere on the train ride west, somewhere between Ohio and Indiana, when the landscape opened up, and she had felt, for the first time in years, that the world was larger than her stepmother's parlor. What kept her awake was the specific, gnawing discomfort of a problem she could see clearly but couldn't yet name completely. Harris found her in the ranch office just after 6, bent over 3 years of purchase records she'd arranged in chronological order across the desk. You're up early, he said. I don't sleep much. She didn't look up. Harris, who handled the feed contracts before last year. He came to stand beside her. Mr. Carter handled them himself. Then he took on the Henley property lease and the North expansion, and things got busy. Started delegating, to whom, a pause, a man named Rourke. Managed the supply side for about 8 months. Where is Rourke now? Another pause, longer this time. He left. Said he had a better offer. Eleanor set her pen down and looked at Harris directly. Let me guess, Whitmore. Harris's jaw tightened. We couldn't prove it. She turned back to the ledgers and ran her finger down a column of figures. These feed contracts from last October, the pricing is wrong. Not wildly wrong, but consistently wrong. Every order from Kellerman Supplies is invoiced at 6% above the standard rate for the territory. Harris leaned in and looked where she was pointing. That's $240 over 8 months, Eleanor continued. On feed alone. I haven't gone through the equipment invoices yet. Harris was quiet for a moment that had weight to it. You found that in one night. I find things quickly. She closed the ledger. Someone was either incompetent or they were taking a percentage. Given that the same person left for your largest competitor, I know which I'd bet on. She looked at him. Nathaniel needs to see this. He won't like it. No, Eleanor agreed, he won't. But he needs to see it anyway. Nathaniel didn't like it. She watched him read through the figures she'd laid out twice, slowly, with the particular stillness of a man absorbing information that's changing the shape of something he believed was settled. His expression didn't collapse. She had noticed that about him he didn't perform his emotions for an audience. When something hit him, it hit him quietly, and you had to watch carefully to see it land. 8 months, he said, at minimum. I only reviewed the last 3 years. The pattern may go back further. He looked up from the ledger. You found this last night. I couldn't sleep. He studied her for a moment. Why didn't you wait? Why bring this this morning instead of? He paused. You could have used this. Held it. People hold things like this. It was an honest question, and she gave it an honest answer. Because it's your ranch, not mine, and because you deserve to know what's happening on your own land. She paused. I'm not here to accumulate leverage, Mr. Carter. I'm here because I want to be useful. He was quiet for a long moment, then he said, Nathaniel. She looked at him. You called me Mr. Carter, he said. You've been calling me Mr. Carter for 2 weeks. My name is Nathaniel. Something in the room shifted, small but unmistakable. The way temperature changes before a storm, a degree or two that you feel before you consciously register it. Nathaniel, she said. He nodded once. Then he turned back to the ledger, and the moment passed, but it didn't disappear. It settled into the room the way things settle when they've found where they belong. I'm going to need to contact the sheriff, Nathaniel said, and get the Kellerman invoices audited independently. He was already thinking ahead, already processing, already moving through the problem with the practical efficiency she'd come to recognize in him. This could take weeks to untangle. I can help with the audit, Eleanor said. If you want. He looked at her. I have 3 years of practice reading accounts, she said. I'm faster than whoever you'd hire in town, and I already know what I'm looking at. A beat. Yes, he said, I want. The audit took 11 days. They worked side by side in the ranch office. Eleanor running the numbers while Nathaniel cross-referenced with supplier records he'd sent Harris to collect from 3 different towns. They developed a working rhythm that surprised her with its ease. She'd expected friction. The particular friction of a man who wasn't accustomed to a woman knowing things he didn't. But Nathaniel moved past that adjustment in the first 2 days and simply treated her the way he'd treat a competent partner, which was the greatest professional courtesy anyone had ever extended to her. By day 4, they had identified 4 separate accounts with irregular pricing. By day 7, they had a number $612 diverted over 14 months. By day 9, 2 of the current workers had quietly confirmed to Harris, not to Nathaniel directly, which itself said something, that Rourke had been feeding operational information to Whitmore's people before he left. Schedules, inventory levels, the timing of Nathaniel's trips to the territory capital. He's been watching this place for over a year, Eleanor said. They were alone in the office. Late evening, the kind of quiet that settles into working spaces after everyone else has gone. Nathaniel stood at the window with his back to her, and she could see from the set of his shoulders the weight he was carrying, not just the financial loss, which was significant but manageable, but the specific betrayal of it. He was a man who trusted carefully and valued loyalty. Having that used against him was a different kind of damage than the dollar figures represented. I hired Rourke myself, he said, checked his references. Thought I had good judgment. You do have good judgment, Eleanor said. Rourke's references were apparently good, because Whitmore made sure they were. You can't vet against someone who planned the deception from the start. I should have caught it. You were building an expansion and managing a drought year and running a crew of 20 men, Eleanor said. You missed it because you trusted someone you had reason to trust. That's not bad judgment. That's being human, he turned. He looked at her with the kind of expression that she hadn't seen directed at her before, not pity, not assessment, not the careful management of a person handling something fragile. Something else, something that recognized her as fully herself. You're very direct, he said. Does that bother you? No, he said it immediately. No, it doesn't. He moved back to the desk, sat down across from her. Can I ask you something? Yes, your family. The ones who sent you here. He chose his words with the same careful deliberateness she'd noticed before. the habit of a man who understood that the wrong phrasing could open the wrong door. Do they know what they lost? The question landed somewhere she wasn't prepared for. She took a moment before she answered. They didn't believe they were losing anything, she said. They believed they were disposing of something. There's a difference. There is, he agreed. He was watching her. And you? Do you miss it? Providence, the life you had there. She thought about it honestly. I miss my father, she said. The life, no. I spent 27 years in a house where I was tolerated. There's nothing to miss about being tolerated. What do you want instead? It was the same question he'd asked at the boarding house on her first night, and she'd given an answer then to be useful, to build something, to be seen, but it felt different now. 11 days later, sitting across from him in the quiet of the evening with $612 worth of recovered accountability between them. I want what I'm doing right now, she said, work that matters. A place where what I know counts for something. He nodded slowly. Not the polite nod. It counts, he said. Outside, a horse came into us. Then it should have the sound of hooves at the wrong pace for the hour, the wrong urgency for an ordinary evening return. Both of them heard it. Nathaniel was on his feet first. Eleanor followed without discussion. They stepped onto the porch together to find Harris dismounting with the specific haste of a man carrying bad news that won't wait. There's been an offer, Harris said, catching his breath. Whitmore's lawyer was in town today, filed paperwork with the county office. He's claiming the Northeast water rights are disputed. Says his property boundaries include the creek access. The silence that followed had a different texture than the silences inside. That's not possible, Nathaniel said. My deed is clear. His lawyer is saying the original survey was in error. Harris looked between them. He filed today, which means by the county rules, you have 30 days to contest before the dispute goes to arbitration. And if it goes to arbitration, with Whitmore's lawyers against the county public representation, Harris paused. He buys his way through arbitration. Everyone knows it. Nathaniel's jaw set. Get me Morrison's number. He's the best property attorney in the territory. Morrison's already been retained, Harris said, by Whitmore. His clerk told me this afternoon. The weight of that landed across the porch like something physical. Eleanor's mind was already moving. She'd handled property documentation for her father's estate. For 3 years, she knew deed law well enough to know that original surveys were the critical document, that disputes hinged on the accuracy of the earliest recorded boundary. When was the property originally deeded, she asked. 68, Nathaniel said. My father filed the original claim. Is the original survey document here, on the ranch? Should be in the deed box. He stopped, looked at Harris. When did Rourke leave exactly? Harris went very still. 3 weeks ago, Harris said. He had access to the office until the day before he gave notice. The three of them looked at each other. The deed box, Eleanor said. They went inside fast. The deed box was a heavy iron document case that Nathaniel kept in the lower drawer of the office cabinet. He had it open in 30 seconds. The documents inside land patents, water rights certificates, cattle brand registrations going back to his father's time were intact. Except for one. The original boundary survey, filed 1868. The document that would definitively establish the creek access as Carter land. Gone, not misplaced, gone. The divider where it should have sat was empty with the specific emptiness of something recently removed. Nathaniel stood very still with the open box in his hands. Eleanor was already thinking. The county office will have a copy, she said. Original deeds are always duplicated on file, unless Whitmore's already moved on the county copy, Harris said quietly. Can he do that? Eleanor looked at Nathaniel. With enough money and enough time, Nathaniel set the box down carefully. He's had 14 months to plan this. Then we find the third copy, Eleanor said. Both men looked at her. Original land surveys from that period were typically filed in 3 locations, she said. County office, the claimant's personal records, which is what's been taken, and the Territorial Land Commission office in Helena. The territorial records are federal jurisdiction. Whitmore can't touch them without federal charges. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. How do you know that? My father contested a property boundary in 1874, she said. I was 17. I read every document in that process. She paused. Is there someone in Helena you trust? Yes, Nathaniel said. My father's old partner, James Kellard. He's been retired for 6 years, but he knows the territorial office. Send a wire tonight, Eleanor said. Request confirmation and a certified copy of the 1868 survey. If the territorial copy is intact, Whitmore's challenge collapses. Nathaniel was already moving toward the door. He stopped with one hand on the frame and turned back to look at Eleanor standing in the middle of his office, surrounded by open ledgers and the empty deed box, with the particular stillness of someone who's just stopped a landslide from the inside. Eleanor, she looked at him. Thank you, he said. It wasn't the formal thank you of professional courtesy. It was something older and more specific, the kind of gratitude that carries weight because it knows exactly what it's grateful for. She nodded once he left. Harris lingered for a moment. He looked at Eleanor with an expression she hadn't seen from him. Before something past wariness, past assessment, into territory she might have called respect. He's a good man, Harris said, better than most. He deserved better than what Rourke did, better than what Whitmore's trying to do. I know, Eleanor said. He needed someone, Harris said. Didn't know how to say it, but he needed someone. He picked up his hat. Glad it's you. He left before she could respond, which was probably intentional. Eleanor stood alone in the office. She looked at the empty space in the deed box where the survey had been. She thought about Rourke, who had sat in this office, handled these documents, and carried information to a man who wanted to take what wasn't his. She thought about Whitmore, with his calculated smile and his lawyer already retained, and his plan that had been 14 months in the making. She thought about a room in Providence where people had laughed at the idea of sending her here. She picked up the ledger she'd been working from and opened it to the page she'd marked. There was more to find. She was going to find all of it. The wire to Helena went that night. The response came 3 days later, and it was the word they needed. The 1868 survey was on file with the Territorial Land Commission, intact, certified, and a formal copy was being prepared for dispatch. Whitmore's legal challenge didn't collapse immediately. Men, with his resources, don't concede without exhausting every alternative, but its foundation cracked visibly the moment Nathaniel's new attorney, a sharp-minded woman named Ruth Kavanaugh, who'd come up from Billings on the strength of the case's specifics, presented the territorial certification at the county office. Eleanor had found Ruth Kavanaugh. She'd asked Harris, who'd asked a contact in Billings, who'd said that if you had a property case in Montana Territory and needed someone who could go up against Whitmore's people without flinching, there was one name worth knowing. Eleanor had written the letter herself, laid out the facts cleanly, and included the audit figures alongside the timeline of Rourke's employment and departure. Kavanaugh had arrived within the week. She'd shaken Eleanor's hand at the door, glanced once at her scar without comment, and said, "You put this together?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "Good work," Kavanaugh said, and walked inside. Nathaniel, standing behind Eleanor, leaned slightly toward her and said quietly, "Where did you find her?" "I asked the right questions," Eleanor said. He almost smiled. The legal process ground forward with the particular slow brutality of contested property disputes, but the trajectory was clear to anyone reading it correctly. Whitmore had bet on the missing survey. Without it, his case was constructed on inference and a competing survey that Kavanaugh's analysis exposed as commissioned specifically for this challenge, ordered 14 months prior. The same week, Rourke had joined the Carter operation. That was the piece that changed everything, not just legally, socially. Silver Creek Valley was a community small enough that its social architecture was visible. Everyone knew who stood where, who owed what to whom, whose opinion carried weight. And when the story emerged, not all at once, but in the way these things emerge in small communities, piece by piece, each piece landing with its own specific weight, the reaction was not subtle. Whitmore had targeted Carter land systematically, had planted a man inside the operation, had attempted to steal a boundary survey, had filed a fraudulent challenge. Two of the smaller ranch owners who'd sold to Whitmore the previous year came forward with stories that hadn't previously found their way into official accounts. A clerk at the county office resigned unexpectedly and relocated to Billings. Whitmore himself remained in the territory, which took a particular kind of nerve. He came to the ranch once more. Eleanor was in the yard when his horse came up the track, and she didn't move. She stood where she was and watched him approach, with the same attention she'd have given any incoming weather that needed to be assessed. He dismounted, looked at her, then looked past her toward the ranch house. "Is Carter here?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "What do you want?" The question landed without social softening, and Whitmore's expression adjusted the smile, not quite finding its usual purchase. "I'd like to speak with him." "I'll get him," Eleanor said. "But I'll tell you now, whatever you've come to say it in front of me." A beat. Whitmore looked at her with something that had shifted since the first dinner. The easy contempt was still present, but it had acquired an edge of something that was not quite respect, but was its unwilling cousin. He'd underestimated her. Men who underestimated things rarely enjoyed discovering it. "You're bolder than I expected," he said. "You expected what they told you," Eleanor said. "They were wrong about most things." Nathaniel appeared at the door. He took in the yard, Eleanor standing, Whitmore still holding his horse's reins, and walked out to stand beside Eleanor without a word, which was itself a statement. Whitmore looked between them. "I came to discuss settlement," he said. "There's nothing to settle," Nathaniel said. "The survey is authenticated." "The challenge fails. The legal matter, yes." Whitmore's voice had lost some of its earlier ease. "But I'm speaking of the broader situation. The territory is better served when its major landholders maintain productive relationships." "You sent a man into my operation to steal from me," Nathaniel said. "That's not a disagreement between neighbors. That's something else." "I can't speak to Rorkers." "Don't." Nathaniel's voice was level, but it had no give in it. Eleanor had heard that voice before only once, when Harris had brought him the news about the missing survey, and she recognized it now. It was the voice of a man who had moved past the point where managing the conversation mattered. "I know what happened. You know I know. Don't come to my ranch and perform ignorance." "I don't have patience for it." Whitmore was quiet for a moment that cost him something. He looked at Eleanor. "You did this," he said, not accusatory. Almost wondering, all of it. "I helped," Eleanor said. "They stopped. Ugly?" Eleanor said. "Yes, they said a lot of things." She looked at him steadily. None of them were very interesting. Something moved across Whitmore's face, not quite shame, but its distant relative. He was not, Eleanor understood in that moment, a man built for being wrong. It sat badly on him, the way the wrong size coat sits badly visible from across the room. He mounted his horse. At the yard's edge he stopped and looked back. "You're a formidable woman, Miss Whitfield," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "I am," he rode out. The yard was quiet. Nathaniel stood beside her and said nothing for a long moment, and Eleanor stood beside him and said nothing either. And it was the first silence between them that felt entirely comfortable. The silence of two people who don't need to fill space, because the space doesn't feel empty. Then Nathaniel said, "That was the first time I've seen him leave without getting what he came for." "Get used to it," Eleanor said. He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh fully, not the almost law, not the suppressed version, and the sound of it did something unexpected to her chest. Loosened something that had been held tightly for a long time. She didn't examine it, not yet, but she noted it. That evening, at dinner, Harris raised a cup of coffee in Eleanor's direction across the table without comment. Billy, the young hand who had stared at her scar on her first day, passed her the bread without being asked and said, "Miss Whitfield, is it true you found the attorney who beat Whitmore's lawyer?" "I found her," Eleanor said. "She did the beating." "Still," Billy said, with the straightforward admiration of someone who hasn't yet learned to disguise it. "That's something." Nathaniel was watching her from across the table. When the meal was done and the hands had gone out, and Harris had taken himself off to the bunkhouse, Eleanor stayed to help clear. She always stayed. It was simply what she did, and Nathaniel stayed too, which was newer. They worked, side by side in the kitchen quiet. At a certain point he said, without turning, "What do you want to do next?" She understood he didn't mean tomorrow, he meant generally. He meant the question that had been sitting between them since she'd arrived, the one with the shape of a future in it. "I want to rebuild the supply contracts," she said. "The ones Rourke compromised. And I want to look at the Eastern Fence situation you mentioned, in the 7th letter. The water access issue that keeps recurring." He paused. "That's not what I meant." She knew it wasn't what he meant. She set down what she was holding and turned to look at him. He was watching her with an expression that had no performance in it, nothing managed, nothing calculated. She was learning to read his face, the way you learn the particular weather of a place you've decided to live in, not mastered, not complete, but beginning to be familiar. "I want to stay," she said. "If there's a reason to..." "There's a reason," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Montana moved in its enormous, indifferent dark, and inside this small, lit space, two people stood close enough that the gap between them was more absence than presence, and neither of them closed it yet, but neither of them stepped back. "Then I'll stay," Eleanor said, nodded. Not the formal nod. The real one. The kind that means something has been decided, and it isn't going to be undecided. She picked up what she'd set down and finished what she was doing, and he did too, and neither of them spoke again for the rest of the evening. But something had changed, quietly and completely, the way the best changes happen, not announced, not performed, simply real. What Eleanor didn't know, what she wouldn't discover until the following week when a letter arrived from Providence bearing her stepmother's handwriting, was that the story of what she had done here had traveled east faster than anyone expected. Someone had talked. Someone always talked. And Vivian Whitfield, who had sent Eleanor to Montana as a joke, as a disposal, as a punishment for a wealthy rancher who had presumed to reach above his station, Vivian, had read the account and had understood, for the first time in 27 years of deliberate blindness, that the daughter she had discarded was not what she had told herself she was. The letter that arrived was not an apology. Eleanor would not have recognized it if it had been. What it was a demand, a reminder of family obligation. A suggestion, phrased with Vivian's characteristic silk over steel elegance, that Eleanor's current fortunate circumstances might benefit from the renewed involvement of family support. Eleanor read it twice. She folded it, she held it for a moment. Then she carried it to the kitchen stove and put it in with the morning kindling. She watched it catch, she watched it burn, and she went back to work. The letter from Vivian burned fast. Eleanor watched the last edge curl black and disappear, and then she closed the stove door and didn't think about it again. That was the discipline she had built over 27 years, not the absence of feeling, but the refusal to let feeling become a residence. You could feel something, and still choose not to live inside it. She had work to do. The supply contracts were the first priority. Ruth Cavanaugh had returned to Billings after the legal matter resolved, but not before handing Eleanor a list of contacts, suppliers in the territory with clean reputations, established ranchers who could provide references. A land commissioner in Helena named Aldrich, who Cavanaugh described as honest, which she said as though it were an unusual characteristic worth noting specifically. Eleanor spent a week writing letters. Methodical, precise, each one tailored to what she'd learned about each supplier from the records she'd audited. She wasn't guessing. She was working from information, which was the only way she knew how to work. Nathaniel read the first 3 drafts she showed him, and then stopped asking to read them. "Just send them," he said. "You know what you're doing." It was, she thought, the most practical expression of trust she had ever received. The responses came back over the following 2 weeks, and the new contracts were cleaner and cheaper than what Rourke had negotiated. Harris confirmed the first delivery under the new Kellerman arrangement, renegotiated, properly priced, and came to find Eleanor in the office with an expression she was learning to read as his version of impressed, which on Harris's face looked mostly like the absence of skepticism. "That's $42 saved on this order alone," he said. "Over a year that compounds," Eleanor said. "I want to do the equipment contracts next." "Of course you do," Harris said, and there was something almost warm in it. The ranch was finding its rhythm again. Not the tentative rhythm of the weeks before, when the Whitmore challenge had been live, and the missing survey had cast everything in a kind of held-breath uncertainty. But something steadier, the rhythm of a place that has survived something and come out the other side with its footing intact. Eleanor felt it. She suspected Nathaniel felt it too, though he expressed it differently in the way he moved around the property, with less of that barely contained tightness she'd noticed in him during the legal fight, and more of the ease of a man in his own element. She was thinking about the eastern fence problem one morning, turning over the figures in her head while the ranch house came to life around her, when Billy knocked on the office door and said, "Miss Whitfield, there's someone here." "Who?" Billy looked uncomfortable in the way of a young person who's been handed a piece of information they're not sure how to deliver. "Says her name is Mrs. Clara Harrington. Says she's your sister." Eleanor went very still. "She came alone?" "No, ma'am." "She's got a man with her, tall fellow, fancy clothes." Billy paused. "And there's a woman, older, real." He searched for the word. "Stiff-looking." Eleanor set down her pen. She had not seen Clara in 8 months. Not since the morning she'd walked out of the Providence parlor with a train ticket in her pocket and her stepmother's laughter following her into the hallway. Clara who had laughed. Clara who had called the whole arrangement ridiculous. Clara whose refusal had created the opening that Vivian had seized to dispose of Eleanor. She walked out of the office and through the front of the ranch house and onto the porch. Clara was exactly as she remembered, beautiful in the effortless, slightly careless way that people who have always been beautiful sometimes are, as though appearance is something that happens to them rather than something they curate. She was dressed for travel, still managed to look like dressed for an occasion, and she was standing in the Carter yard looking at everything with the bright, acquisitive curiosity of someone who had arrived at a place they find more interesting than they expected. The man beside her was her husband, Frederick Harrington, whom Eleanor had met twice and remembered as someone who filled rooms with confident noise and very little substance. And behind Clara, standing slightly apart with the rigid posture of a woman who would rather be anywhere else but refuses to show it, was Vivian. So the letter hadn't been enough. She'd come in person. Eleanor stood on the porch and felt the specific weight of her past, arriving without invitation into the life she had been building, and she let herself feel it for exactly 3 seconds, the old shrinking, the old reflex to make herself smaller, and then she let it go. She was not the woman who had stepped off a train 8 months ago. "Eleanor," Clara said, and her voice carried the warmth of someone who has decided to be warm as a strategic choice. She came forward with her hands extended, as though they were old friends rather than sisters, who had last shared a room where Eleanor's humiliation was being planned as entertainment. You look well, Clara," Eleanor said. She did not take the extended hands, not out of cruelty, out of honesty. "This is unexpected. We were traveling through the territory," Frederick said, from behind Clara, with the easy claim of a man who has never been questioned about his explanations. "Thought we'd pay a visit. Helena is 2 days east," Eleanor said. "Silver Creek Valley isn't on the way to anything from Providence." A small silence. Clara dropped her hands. Vivian stepped forward. She looked, Eleanor thought, older than 8 months should have made her not physically. Vivian was too controlled for that, but something behind her eyes was different. Something tighter. The composure was the same, but the ease behind it was gone. "Eleanor," she said. "You're looking." A pause in which she assessed Eleanor the way she always had, from the outside in, beginning with the visible and working toward whatever conclusion she'd already reached before looking. "Different." "I'm not different," Eleanor said. "You're just seeing me for the first time." Vivian blinked. It was a small thing, but on Vivian's face it was the equivalent of a flinch. "We'd like to come in," Clara said. "We've traveled a long way." "You're welcome to come in," Eleanor said. She stepped aside. Then, without raising her voice, Harris appeared from the direction of the barn with the promptness of a man who had been watching the yard and had a reasonable idea of what was needed. "Miss Whitfield, Mr. Carter is with the East herd," Eleanor said. "Would you let him know we have guests?" "Of course," Harris said. He looked at the 3 arrivals, with the brief, comprehensive assessment of a man who's dealt with difficult people before, nodded once, and went. She brought them inside. She made coffee. She did these things with the calm efficiency that had become her natural register, not performed composure but actual steadiness. The steadiness of a person who knows where she is and why. Clara looked around the ranch house with barely concealed interest, and Eleanor watched her recalibrate in real time whatever she had imagined she would find here. It wasn't this. The house was not elegant, but it was substantial and well-ordered, and held the particular warmth of a place people actually lived and worked in. It's quite functional, Clara said. Yes, Eleanor agreed. That's what I like about it. Frederick had positioned himself near the window and was looking out at the property with the expression of a man performing a financial assessment. Eleanor had seen that expression before on men in Providence who came to visit her father, the look of someone pricing what they see. Substantial acreage, Frederick said. Yes, Eleanor said. Carter runs cattle, among other things. Profitable operation. Eleanor looked at him steadily. What specifically did you want to know, Frederick? He turned from the window and smiled the smile of a man who'd been caught doing something he thought was subtle. Just curious, I'm sure, Eleanor said. Vivienne, who had been quiet since the porch, unusual for Vivienne, whose silences were always weighted, set down her coffee cup and said, "We came because we were concerned." Were you? Eleanor said. Stories travel, Vivienne said. We heard about the legal matter, the property dispute. It was resolved, Eleanor said. We heard that too. A pause. We also heard that you were centrally involved. I was, Eleanor. Vivienne's voice shifted into something that might, from a distance, have resembled maternal concern. You're in a delicate position here. A woman alone, in a working arrangement with a man, in the territories. These situations have consequences for a woman's reputation. Eleanor looked at her stepmother for a long moment. I'm not alone, she said. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. You're not officially, not yet, Eleanor said. Clara looked up sharply. Even Frederick turned from the window. Vivienne's composure held, but the effort was visible now in a way it rarely was. What do you mean not yet? I mean what I said. Eleanor picked up her own cup. Is there something specific you came to say? Or did you travel 2 weeks to deliver a concern that could have gone in a letter? The letter. Vivienne stopped. Burned, Eleanor said pleasantly. I burned it the morning it arrived. A silence with considerable texture. The door opened. Nathaniel walked in, and the room rearranged itself around his entrance, the way rooms do when someone with actual authority arrives, not because he performed it, but because it was simply real. He'd clearly come straight from the work. He was dusty, unhurried, entirely himself. He looked at Eleanor first. It was a small thing, but Clara saw it, and something in Clara's expression shifted. A recalculation, swift and involuntary. Nathaniel, Eleanor said, this is my stepmother, Vivienne Whitfield, my sister Clara Harrington, and her husband Frederick. She paused. They came from Providence. Nathaniel looked at the three of them with the same level, unhurried attention he gave everything. He shook Frederick's hand. He nodded to Clara. He looked at Vivienne for a moment with the particulars of a man who has been told a story and is now seeing its author in person. Mr. Carter, Vivienne said, and produced her social warmth, the way she produced everything precisely, on demand, without a crack in the surface. We've heard so much about your property. It's wonderful to see Eleanor settled so comfortably. She's more than settled, Nathaniel said. His tone was even, but it had no give in it. She runs half this operation. Clara made a small sound. Frederick looked at Eleanor with an expression she'd never seen him direct at her before. Something close to reassessment. Vivienne smiled. How wonderful. The lunch that Harris's wife Agnes prepared was the most socially complicated meal Eleanor had sat through since Providence, and given that Providence had produced some genuinely difficult dinners, that was saying something. Frederick talked about business and Eastern markets, and the general uncertainty of territorial economies, with the confidence of a man who knows very little about the specifics, but a great deal about how to sound authoritative. Vivienne asked Nathaniel questions about the ranch with the bright, slightly predatory curiosity of someone building a file. Clara was mostly quiet, which was unusual enough that Eleanor watched her. After the meal, Nathaniel found reason to take Frederick out to look at the property. Eleanor suspected this was deliberate. Nathaniel was not a man who performed unnecessary tasks, and she was briefly grateful for it, because what she needed was a conversation without Frederick's noise in the room. Vivian waited until the door had closed, and then said, not directly, in the voice she used when the performance was over, "He cares about you." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I didn't expect that," Vivian said. "I know." Clara, still at the table, turned her cup slowly in her hands. She'd been doing that for 10 minutes. Eleanor recognized the gesture. It was what Clara did when she was working towards something she wasn't sure how to say. "I should have come instead of you," Clara said finally. "When the letter came. I should have at least read all of them." Eleanor looked at her sister. The old anger was there. She'd be dishonest to say it wasn't the specific anger of a person who was used as a substitute, who was sent as a discardable option, who had been laughed at while her humiliation was planned. But anger, she had learned, was an expensive residence. You could acknowledge it without moving in. "You didn't want to come," Eleanor said. "I did. It worked out." "That's not." Clara stopped. "Started again." "I laughed," she said, "when Mother suggested sending you." "I laughed." "Yes," Eleanor said. "You did." "I'm sorry," Clara said. The words were plain and unembellished, without Vivian's social architecture around them, and because of that Eleanor believed them. Clara was not, at her core, cruel. She was thoughtless in the specific way of people who have never had to think about consequences, because consequences had always landed on someone else. "I know," Eleanor said. "Is it enough?" Clara asked. Sorry. Eleanor thought about it honestly, because she wasn't the kind of person who offered comfort that wasn't true. "It's a start," she said. Vivian had been quiet through this exchange, with the particular quiet of a woman who knew this conversation wasn't hers to participate in. Now she said, in a voice stripped of its usual elegant armor, "I sent you to fail." "Yes," Eleanor said, "you did." Vivian paused. "I believed what I'd always believed about you." "I know what you believed about me," Eleanor said. "You believed I was less capable, less worthy, less valuable than the daughters who looked the way you wanted them to look." She was not angry saying it. She was simply accurate. You were wrong. You were wrong for 27 years. Vivian looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "I was." It was the first honest thing Vivian had said to her in Eleanor's memory. Not an apology. Vivian wasn't built for apologies, and Eleanor didn't need one. But an acknowledgement. The simple factual admission that the verdict had been wrong. It landed quietly in Eleanor's chest and sat there. She didn't respond. There wasn't anything to say that would improve on the truth of it. The second day of the visit was easier. The way second days often are, when the hardest thing's already been said. Frederick and Nathaniel found an unexpected common ground in the mechanics of land management. Frederick was more informed about Eastern financing practices than Eleanor had given him credit for, and Nathaniel listened to things that might be useful with the same quality of attention he gave everything. Clara followed Eleanor through the morning's work with an expression of genuine disorientation, not performing interest, but actually confused by what she was seeing, by the version of her older sister, who moved through this place with authority and purpose, and something that Clara had probably never expected to see on Eleanor's face. At one point, watching Eleanor work through the Eastern fence proposal, she'd been developing a new routing that would solve the water access recurring problem at lower cost than the current repair cycle. Clara said, "You're happy." Eleanor paused, considered it. "Yes, you weren't," Clara said. "In Providence, you weren't happy." "No," Eleanor agreed. "I wasn't. I didn't notice," Clara said. "I didn't notice because I wasn't looking." She said it plainly, without decoration. It was, Eleanor thought, the most honest thing Clara had ever said to her. "Most people weren't," Eleanor said. "It's all right." "It's not," Clara said. "But I understand if you don't need it to be different now." Eleanor looked at her sister, this woman she'd grown up beside and never quite beside, always at a slight distance, always in the shadow of Clara's particular radiance. She looked at her and felt the specific, complicated weight of family, not love exactly, not resentment exactly, but something that contained both and was more specific than either. "I don't need anything from Providence anymore," Eleanor said, honestly. "But I don't need to cut it off either. You can write to me if you want." I'd like that, Clara said quietly. The afternoon of the third day brought a complication that had nothing to do with Eleanor's family. A rider came in fast, from the northeast quarter, and Harris met him in the yard and came immediately to find Nathaniel, and the expression on Harris's face was the one Eleanor had learned to read as serious without being controlled yet. 3 cattle dead in the northeast pasture, not age, not injury. Sick. The word moved through the ranch fast, the way bad news moves in working places, first as information, then as implication, then as fear. Because one sick animal could be isolated circumstance. 3 in the same pasture overnight could be the beginning of something much worse. Nathaniel was moving before Harris finished the sentence. Eleanor was right behind him. She heard Frederick say something to Clara about staying inside. Heard Clara's sharp response that Eleanor was going, and she intended to follow, didn't wait to hear how that resolved. At the northeast pasture, the scale of it was visible immediately. 3 down, and a 4th moving badly, that particular unsteady, listing gait that Eleanor had seen once before, at her father's estate when a bad feed batch had come through, before she'd caught the supplier error. She stopped. When did the new northeast feed delivery come in, she asked. Harris turned, 4 days ago, from which supplier? Harris's expression shifted. That's from the old Kellerman contract. The transition order. The last one under the previous pricing, before the new contract kicked in. Eleanor looked at the sick animals. She looked at Nathaniel. I need to see the delivery manifest. They had it in 10 minutes. Billy had run for it and come back breathing hard, the paper creased from his pocket. Eleanor read it standing in the middle of the yard, and what she found made her chest go cold in a very specific way. The delivery had come from a sub-supplier. A different processing point than usual, substituted without notation, signed off by, she checked the countersignature, a name she didn't recognize. This name, she said, holding the manifest up for Harris. Who signed off on receipt? Harris looked. That's not one of our men. No, Eleanor said. It's not. Nathaniel took the paper from her and read it. His jaw tightened in the way she'd come to know. Whitmore. The legal challenge failed, Eleanor said, but a sick herd wouldn't be traceable to him. A contaminated feed batch looks like bad luck, or supplier error, she paused. It looks like the kind of trouble that makes a man reconsider selling. Nathaniel looked at her. The yard was very quiet around them. Can you prove it? He said. I need the feed sample, and I need to identify this sub-supplier, Eleanor said. If the sub-supplier connects to Whitmore's operation directly or through a contracted associate, then yes. What do you need? Harris to isolate the northeast herd immediately and pull the remaining feed from distribution. And access to Whitmore's public business registrations at the county office, who he contracts with, who he supplies through. I can be in town in 2 hours, Harris said. Go now, Nathaniel said. Harris was already moving. Nathaniel turned back to Eleanor. Around them, the ranch workers had gathered in the loose, attentive way of people who understand that something consequential is being decided. Frederick and Clara had come out from the house and were standing at the yard's edge, Clara watching Eleanor, with the expression she'd had all visit that continuous, recalibrating surprise. You knew immediately, Nathaniel said quietly. Not a question. I've seen contaminated feed before, Eleanor said. And I've seen what happened to the smaller ranches Whitmore targeted. Trouble that looks like bad luck. She looked at him. He's patient. He tries the legal route, and when that fails, he tries something that can't be connected. How do you know so much about how men like that operate? Because I grew up around them, Eleanor said. Different territory. Same mechanics, she paused. Men who believe the world owes them what they want, and arrange things so the cost falls on someone else. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Are you all right? The question surprised her, not the fact of it, but the timing, the specific attention of it. The way he'd noticed that this was taking something from her, even as she handled it. Yes, she said, then, I will be. He nodded. He touched her arm briefly, just his hand on her forearm for a moment, and then turned to organize the herd isolation with Harris. But Eleanor felt it, the touch, the specific, deliberate weight of it. The way it communicated something that didn't need words, and was better for not having them. Vivian had come out onto the yard as well. Eleanor hadn't noticed until she heard her stepmother's voice from behind her. "What can I do?" Eleanor turned. Vivian stood there, dressed impractically for ranch work, with an expression that had shed the last of its social architecture. She looked. Eleanor found the word after a moment genuine. Stripped of performance. Just a woman standing in a ranch yard, asking what she could do. "Can you cook?" Eleanor asked. "Adequately," Vivian said. "Agnes will need help in the kitchen," Eleanor said. "We're going to have long days ahead, and the hands need feeding." Vivian nodded. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the house. Clara appeared at Eleanor's side. "Tell me what to do." Eleanor looked at her sister. "Can you write a clear hand?" "Yes. Come with me," Eleanor said. "I need someone to copy records while I cross-reference them." Clara followed without question. It took 2.5 days. The sub-supplier connected to Whitmore through a contracted intermediary, a man named Duval, who operated out of a trading post 60 miles east, and who had, as Harris discovered through careful inquiry, received a significant payment from Whitmore's operation 3 weeks prior to the feed delivery. The contaminated batch was isolated before spread further. 4 animals were lost in total. The herd stabilized. Ruth Kavanaugh, reached by wire in Billings, returned within 4 days with a sheriff's deputy and a document that named Duval, named the payment, and named Whitmore as the authorizing party. Whitmore was gone from Silver Creek Valley before the week ended. Eleanor didn't watch him go. She heard about it from Billy, who'd been in town when Whitmore's household was packed and his horses loaded, and who'd reported back with the barely concealed glee of a young man who'd watched something satisfying happen. His lawyer went first, Billy reported. Then the house staff. Then him, fast too, like he had reason to hurry. "He did," Eleanor said. "Where do you think he went?" "Somewhere that doesn't know him yet," Eleanor said. "He'll do the same things there. But that's not our problem anymore." The evening after Whitmore left, Eleanor sat on the porch with Nathaniel, in the specific quiet of a crisis that has passed and left its absence behind. The kind of quiet that sounds different from ordinary quiet, because it carries the weight of what isn't happening anymore. Vivian and Clara and Frederick were leaving in the morning. The goodbye had already happened in its essential form during 2.5 days of shared work, of Vivian in Agnes' kitchen, and Clara copying documents in Eleanor's office, and Frederick doing what Frederick could, which turned out to be more than Eleanor had estimated. "Your family," Nathaniel said. "Not a question, an observation with a door in it." "Complicated," Eleanor said. "Most families are. They came to retrieve me," Eleanor said. "Or to verify that I was worth retrieving. I'm not entirely sure which." "Are you going back?" She looked at no, she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor." "Yes. I need to ask you something," he said. "And I need you to know that I'm not asking it because of the crisis, or because of what you did this week, or because I feel obligated. I'm asking it because I've been wanting to ask it for 6 weeks, and I keep finding reasons not to." Her heart was doing something she wasn't going to examine closely right now. "Then ask it," she said. He turned to look at her. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not as an arrangement. Not as a convenience, as my wife, the person I want beside me for the rest of my life." The Montana night was enormous around them. Eleanor had spent 27 years being told, in various registers and with various degrees of cruelty, that this question would never come to her. That she was too plain, too marked, too much and not enough simultaneously. She had believed it long enough that the unbelieving had taken real work, not one moment of reversal, but a slow daily practice of choosing differently. She looked at Nathaniel Carter, who had seen her face the first moment she stepped off the train and had moved past it into seeing her, and had kept seeing her, the actual her, the capable and complicated and honest her, with a consistency that felt more real than anything she'd been offered in 27 years of being looked at and not seen. "Yes," she said. He exhaled a long, controlled breath that told her he'd been more nervous than he'd shown. "Yes," he said. She said again. "Don't make me say it a third time." He laughed, and she laughed too. And somewhere in the ranch house behind them, she heard Agnes, who had excellent hearing, and no apparent interest in pretending otherwise, make a sound of profound satisfaction. And from the kitchen, There was the muffled noise of someone receiving news, secondhand, and Clara's voice rising in genuine surprise, and then Frederick's deeper register, and then, quieter than all of them, barely audible through the door but unmistakable, the sound of Vivian Whitfield crying. Not with grief. Eleanor knew the difference. With something it had taken her stepmother 27 years and 2,000 miles to find. She sat beside Nathaniel on the porch and listened to her past, making its peace with itself, and she let it, and she turned her face toward the enormous Montana dark, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The morning after Vivian and Clara left, the ranch felt different. Not quieter, the ranch was never truly quiet. There was always the sound of work, of animals, of the ordinary machinery of a place that produced something real, but the specific pressure that 3 visitors from Eleanor's past had brought with them had lifted. And what remained was the particular clarity of a life that had been tested and had held. Eleanor stood in the ranch office before anyone else was fully awake and looked at the proposal she'd been developing for the eastern fence rerouting. She had the figures, she had the contractor contacts. She had the cost comparison laid out in 3 columns that made the decision obvious to anyone who looked at them honestly. She had been a woman waiting to be useful her entire life. She was done waiting. Harris knocked on the doorframe at 6:30. He looked at the papers spread across the desk, and then at Eleanor, and said, with the directness she'd come to appreciate, "You didn't sleep." "I slept enough," she said. "I want to talk to you about the northeast fence before Nathaniel comes in." Eleanor. He said her given name, which he'd started doing somewhere in the middle of the Whitmore crisis, quietly and without announcement, as though it were simply the accurate thing. "You just got engaged last night, I know," she said. "The fence still needs fixing." Harris looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down across from her and said, "All right. Show me." Nathaniel came in at 7 to find them deep in the logistics, and instead of interrupting, he poured himself coffee and pulled a chair to the edge of the desk and listened, which was something Eleanor had noticed about him, his capacity for listening, without the peculiar impatience of men who believed their arrival in a room should redirect it. When she finished, he said, "The Eastern contractor Bellamy. He did the Hendricks property rebuild last spring," Eleanor said. Harris checked. "Clean work, fair pricing, finished 2 weeks ahead." "I know Bellamy," Nathaniel said. "Good man." He looked at the cost comparison. "This saves us $340 over the current repair cycle. Over 2 years, yes. The rerouting adds distance on the front end, but eliminates the recurring water damage problem at the northeast junction. We're spending money on the same problem every 6 months. It's cheaper to solve it once." "Write to Bellamy," Nathaniel said. "I already drafted the letter," Eleanor said. He looked up from the papers. She looked back at him. "Of course you did," he said, and there was something in it, not exasperation, something closer to the specific warmth of a man who is watching someone be entirely and consistently themselves, and finding, each time, that it's exactly what he wanted. The wedding was set for 6 weeks out. Not because either of them wanted a long engagement. Eleanor had no patience for delay, and Nathaniel even less, but because Agnes, who had appointed herself the operational authority on the matter without anyone officially granting her the position, declared firmly that 6 weeks was the minimum required to do this correctly. And neither Nathaniel nor Eleanor had the particular kind of courage needed to argue with Agnes when she'd made a decision. "She ran this house for 12 years before I came," Nathaniel told Eleanor privately. "I've learned not to fight battles I can't win," wise Eleanor said. "You're not going to fight her either," Nathaniel observed. "Absolutely not," Eleanor said. "The 6 weeks were not quiet ones." 3 days after the engagement, a delegation of Silver Creek Valley's established families arrived at the Carter Ranch, not quite invited, not quite uninvited. In the way of small communities where significant events generate social obligation and social obligations generates visits. They came in pairs and small groups over the course of 4 days, and Eleanor received them all with the calm efficiency she brought to everything. Some came with genuine warmth. The Tendricks family, whose fence rebuild she'd referenced, came bearing Agnes's pie recipe as a gift with the specific logic of people who understood the currency of useful things. Old Mrs. Calder, who'd ranched in the valley for 40 years, and whose opinion carried weight proportional to her tenure, came alone, sat across from Eleanor, examined her face with the frank attention of someone who'd long since stopped caring about social niceties, and said, "You're the one who found the Whitmore operation." "With help," Eleanor said. "Don't diminish it, Mrs." Calder said, "I watched 3 neighbors sell to that man before anyone understood what he was doing." "You stopped him in 9 weeks," she paused. "My granddaughter has a scar on her hand. She's been hiding it since she was 12. She looked at Eleanor directly. "Would you be willing to talk to her sometime?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I would." Mrs. Calder nodded, stood, shook Eleanor's hand once, firmly left. It was the most significant social exchange Eleanor had during those 6 weeks, and she thought about it often afterward, not with the particular ache of old wounds, but with the recognition that what she had built here was not only hers. It was something that other people could use. Not everyone came with warmth. On the 12th day, a woman named Margaret Fowler arrived, wife of the second largest remaining cattle operation in the valley, expensively dressed, with the manner of someone who'd occupied social high ground for long enough that the altitude felt like a right rather than a position. She sat in the Carter parlor and looked at Eleanor with the practiced assessment of a woman taking the measure of someone she's decided is a competitor. "We heard you were from Providence," Mrs. Fowler said. "Manufacturing family?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "And you've been managing the Carter accounts?" "Yes." "Interesting," Mrs. Fowler said in the specific tone that means the opposite. "Women in this valley generally don't involve themselves in the financial side of operations." "I know," Eleanor said. "That seems like a waste of capable people." Mrs. Fowler looked at her sharply. "You stopped the Whitmore challenge, Mrs. Fowler said. "I won't pretend I'm not grateful for that, whatever my thoughts about the rest." She paused. "My husband is grateful. Then perhaps your husband might consider whether his financial records are in order," Eleanor said pleasantly. Whitmore's approach with the Carter operation wasn't original. He used similar tactics on the smaller ranches before he tried property law. If he operated the same way in the next territory, which he likely has, the pattern is documented now. Mrs. Fowler was quiet. "I could put together a summary of what we found," Eleanor said, "for the valley ranchers, so they know what to look for." A long pause. "That would be useful," Mrs. Fowler said. She said it as though the word cost her something. "Good," Eleanor said. "I'll have it to you by the end of the month." Mrs. Fowler left without being warm and without being hostile, which Eleanor counted as a success. She'd dealt with enough Vivian-adjacent women in her life to know that the middle ground was the most you'd get from them initially, and that the middle ground, maintained with consistency, sometimes became something better over time. Nathaniel found her that evening, writing up the summary she'd promised. He leaned in the doorway and watched her for a moment before she noticed him. "How many of those do you have left to do?" he said. "This is the first. You just committed to writing the same thing for every ranching family in the valley." "Probably," Eleanor said. "Is that a problem?" He crossed the room and sat down across from her. "It's not a problem," he said. "It's a lot of work you just took on. On top of the fence proposal, on top of the supply contract review." He paused. "On top of planning a wedding." "Agnes is planning the wedding," Eleanor said. "Agnes is planning the ceremony," Nathaniel said. "You're planning everything. Agnes doesn't consider operational." Eleanor looked up from the paper. He was watching her with the expression she'd come to know as his particular form of attention. Steady, present, without the anxiety that some men brought to watching women they cared about work too hard, which usually manifested as trying to stop them, rather than the more useful option of helping. "I'm all right," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I'm not asking you to stop. I'm asking if you need anything." She considered it honestly. "The Eastern contractor letter needs to go out tomorrow," she said. "If you could sign it tonight, I can get it on the Morning Post." He stood, picked up the drafted letter she'd set to the side. "Read it not quickly, but not slowly either. with the genuine attention he gave things, rather than the performance of attention. Signed it, set it back down. What else, he said. That's all for tonight. He stayed. He didn't leave, didn't find work elsewhere, didn't fill the space with unnecessary conversation. He simply stayed, read his own correspondence, at the far end of the desk while she wrote, occasionally asked a question, occasionally answered one. It was the most comfortable Eleanor had felt in the presence of another person in her memory. At one point he said, without looking up, "You know what you're doing with the Valley Summary is going to make you the most useful person in Silver Creek by the time it's distributed." "That's the idea," Eleanor said. "Some of them won't like it," he said. "Fowler's wife will take the information and never admit you gave it to her. Henderson will probably claim his foreman figured it out. The Calders will be honest." "I know," Eleanor said. "You don't mind?" She thought about it. "I mind when the information doesn't get used," she said. "I don't mind who gets credit for it. The cattle don't care." He laughed, quiet and genuine. "No," he said, "they don't." The wedding fell on a Tuesday in early autumn, which Agnes had selected for reasons that were entirely practical: fewer conflicts with the seasonal work schedule, cooler temperatures, better availability of the traveling minister, who came through the valley quarterly. Eleanor had no objections. She'd spent exactly 0 childhood minutes imagining her wedding, on the grounds that imagining something you've been told won't happen is a specific kind of cruelty to yourself. What she had not anticipated was how it would feel. Not the ceremony itself. The ceremony was brief and honest, conducted in the Carter ranch yard, with the Valley people who'd come, and the ranch hands, who were family, in the practical sense of people who shared consequence. And it was simple in the way of things that don't need ornamentation, because they're already complete. What she hadn't anticipated was the moment before. She was standing in the room Agnes had given her to prepare in, and she was looking at herself in the small mirror on the wall, not the scar specifically, though she was aware of it, the way she was always aware of it. The familiar weight of other people's most frequent first focus, but herself entirely. Her face, the face of a woman who had been sent away as a joke, and had built from the materials of that joke a life that looked like this. Clara had come for the wedding. She'd arrived 2 days prior. Alone, Frederick had business obligations he apparently considered more pressing, which Eleanor thought probably said more about Frederick's marriage than she needed to know. Clara had been different this time, quieter, more observant, less performing. She came into the preparation room and stood beside Eleanor at the mirror and said nothing for a long moment. "Then you look like yourself." "I am myself," Eleanor said. "I mean," Clara paused. "In Providence, you always looked like you were apologizing for something. For existing in a room, for taking up space." She looked at Eleanor's reflection. "You don't look like that anymore." Eleanor looked at the mirror. She thought Clara was right. She couldn't have said when the apology had stopped. It wasn't one moment. It was the accumulation of many, of work that mattered and problems solved, and a man who looked at her the way Nathaniel looked at her, with the specific attention of someone who'd stopped looking for what was wrong and was simply looking at what was there. "Clara," she said, "go right to Frederick." Clara blinked. "What? If you're standing in my preparation room, thinking about your marriage," Eleanor said, not unkindly, "you should write to your husband." Clara opened her mouth, closed it, then quietly, "Is it that obvious?" "To me," Eleanor said, "I've been reading people my whole life. It's what you do when they're too busy looking at your face to notice you're looking back." Clara sat down on the edge of the chair beside the window. "He's not," started, "he's not cruel. He's not like what mother, he's just," a pause, "he's not interested in you specifically or in what you think and feel." "The second one," Clara said quietly. Eleanor looked at her sister. "Then you need to decide what you want to do about that. But not today." She held out her hand. "Today you're going to stand beside me." "All right." Clara took her hand. "All right," she said. The ceremony was as Agnes had planned, efficient and real. Nathaniel said his words without stumbling and without performance, in the same direct register he used for everything, which made Eleanor believe them in a way that elaborate declarations wouldn't have managed. She said hers the same way. The minister pronounced them married. Harris clapped once loudly, from the back of the assembled group, which apparently gave everyone else permission, and the applause that followed was the genuine kind. Billy had made a sign. Eleanor didn't know when he'd found the time, but it was painted on a piece of board in large, slightly uneven letters. "Well done, Mr. And Mrs. Carter, Mrs. Calder, standing beside young Billy, looked at the sign and then at Eleanor with an expression of pure, uncomplicated approval. Nathaniel took Eleanor's hand as they turned to face the assembled people, and his grip was warm and certain and had in it everything that hadn't been said in words over the months of building toward this, all of it held in the simple pressure of one hand in another. "All right," he said quietly, "for her alone. Better than that," she said. The celebration that Agnes had organized extended well into the evening and involved food in quantities that suggested Agnes had been planning this specific event for considerably longer than 6 weeks, which Eleanor strongly suspected was true. The ranch hands ate and told stories, and at a certain point, Billy produced a fiddle from somewhere, and the yard became something that required participation rather than just attendance. Eleanor danced exactly once with Nathaniel, who danced the way he did most things without elegance, but with complete commitment, and it was the best dancing she'd ever experienced, because it was the least performative. At a certain point in the evening, standing at the edge of the gathering with Nathaniel beside her, Eleanor noticed something she filed away quietly. Harris was talking with Mrs. Calder's granddaughter, the girl with the hand scar, who had come with her grandmother to the wedding. The girl was maybe 16, with the particular self-consciousness of a young person who has learned to hold herself at angles that hide the thing she's learned is unwelcome. Harris was telling her something about the cattle operation, asking her questions, listening to her answers with genuine attention. Eleanor watched Harris be kind to someone who needed it and felt something warm and uncomplicated in her chest. Nathaniel followed her gaze. "Harris has a daughter," he said quietly. "She's in Missouri with her mother. He doesn't see her much." Eleanor looked at him. "He never said," she said. "He doesn't," Nathaniel said. "But I know him." They stood for a moment with the particular texture of knowing someone well enough to understand the things they don't say. Then the evening did what evenings do, and the guests went home, and the hands retired to the bunkhouse, and Clara helped Agnes with the clearing in a way that suggested she was making herself useful on purposes. And eventually the yard was quiet and the ranch house lights were low, and Nathaniel and Eleanor stood in the kitchen that was theirs now in the confirmed way. Married now, and there was nothing dramatic about it, and everything right. "I have something for you," Nathaniel said. She looked at him. He went to the shelf beside the fireplace, the one she'd always assumed held old ledgers, and took down a wooden box she hadn't seen before. Small, plain, brought it to the table and set it in front of her. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it," he said. Inside the box were 11 letters. Not the originals, she had those, folded between the accounting ledger pages, where she'd been keeping them since Providence. These were copies, written out by hand, in Nathaniel's own writing, carefully, with the corrections visible where he'd started a word and changed it, exactly like the originals. "Why did you copy them?" she said. "Because you read them before you came," he said. "And you came, and I thought those letters made you decide. I wanted you to have a clean copy, not the ones he had business handled on the back of." He paused. "I wanted you to have the ones that said what I meant." Eleanor looked at the copies in the box. She thought about the first time she'd read them, sitting in the cold front hall of the Providence house, sorting mail that no one else thought to sort, finding these letters from a stranger in Montana who wrote about loneliness and land and wanting something real. She thought about reading them on the train, about the way the 11th letter had settled in her dress pocket like a small, steady weight. She looked up at Nathaniel. "You made these when?" she said. "Over the last 6 weeks," he said. "When you were working after hours, and I pretended I had other things to do." "You didn't have other things to do?" "No," he said. Eleanor looked at the box again. "This is the most thoughtful thing anyone has ever given me," she said. She said it plainly, without the hedging or the social padding that people put around honest emotional statements, because she'd learned that padding diminished the truth rather than protecting it. Nathaniel nodded. Once, he had received the statement without embarrassment, which was one of the things she valued most about him, his capacity to let things matter without making them awkward. "I have something for you too," she said. She went to the office, came back with a folder. He opened it. Inside, a 5-year operational projection for the ranch. Revenue modeling, cost reduction trajectory, expansion phasing, the East Fence project integrated into year 2, new supplier contracts with their long-term pricing implications. A section on staff development and retention that she'd written with specific individuals in mind, including Billy's promotion potential, which she'd noted at the bottom in her precise hand. Nathaniel looked at it for a long time. "You wrote this for the wedding," he said. "I wrote it because it needed to be written," she said. "And because I want you to know that I'm in this, not as an arrangement, as a partner." She paused. "Everything I know and everything I can do, it's yours. If you want it." "I want it," he said. "I want all of it." The night settled into the ranch house around them, and outside the Montana dark was its usual enormous self, indifferent to human arrangements and entirely beautiful for it. And inside, 2 people sat at a kitchen table with a box of copied letters and a 5-year operational plan between them, which was, Eleanor thought, probably the most honest wedding gift exchange in the history of Silver Creek Valley. 3 weeks into their marriage, a letter arrived from Helena. It was from the Territorial Land Commissioner Aldrich, the one Ruth Kavanaugh had named as honest. It was addressed to both of them, which Eleanor noticed and appreciated. The letter contained 2 things: a formal commendation for the documentation Eleanor had compiled regarding Whitmore's methods, which had been shared with the Territorial Authority and was being used to investigate similar patterns in 2 other valleys, and an offer. The Land Commissioner's Office was establishing a new advisory position, Regional Operations Consulting, working with smaller ranches to identify financial irregularities and improve operational practice. It was voluntary, compensated modestly, and would require Eleanor to travel occasionally to advise operations in the broader territory. Nathaniel read it first, handed it to Eleanor without comment. She read it, set it down. "Yes," he said. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think you should do it," he said. "I think you've been doing it informally, for the valley ranches, anyway. This makes it official and gets you into places where the same problems exist and nobody's caught them yet." "It would mean travel," she said, "sometimes 2 or 3 days away." "I know how to run this ranch," he said. "I know you do," she said. "I'm not asking if you can manage." "Then what are you asking?" She looked at him. "I'm asking if you mind." He looked back at her, with the directness she'd fallen in love with. She allowed herself the word now, inside her own thoughts. The way you allow yourself something you've been careful about, until you're certain it's real. Directness, no performance. "Just true, I don't mind," he said. "This valley is better because you came. The rest of the territory deserves the same." He paused. "Write to Aldrich." She wrote the letter that afternoon. Harris, told about the advisory position at dinner, said, "About time someone made it official." Billy said, "Are you going to be famous, Mrs.?" "Absolutely not," Eleanor said. "I think you might be," Billy said with the cheerful certainty of someone who hasn't yet learned that this is not the kind of thing you say to someone's face. Agnes, who was serving soup and had not been directly consulted, said, "She already is," and continued serving. Eleanor looked at Nathaniel across the table. He was trying not to smile and failing completely. She looked around the table. Harris, Billy, 2 of the other hands, Agnes, this assembled group of people who had started as a context and become something she didn't have a single clean word for. Family was close, community was too broad. What they were was specific, people who had watched her prove herself, and then stopped watching because they'd accepted her as simply present, simply real, simply Eleanor, which was the only audience she had ever needed. The valley she'd promised Mrs. Fowler went out at the end of October. 12 copies, 1 for each of the major ranching operations in Silver Creek. She included everything they needed to identify the patterns. Whitmore had used the supplier substitution method, the survey manipulation, the strategic placement of compromised workers, with enough specific detail to be useful and enough plain language to be understood by people who weren't trained in accounts. She heard back from 9 of the 12 within 2 weeks. Henderson's reply said his foreman had identified a similar irregularity in their contracts and was grateful for the guidance. He did not mention Eleanor's name in the letter, which she had expected. He had identified it himself, apparently. Mrs. Fowler's reply was a single line. "This is excellent work. Thank you. No attribution, no credit, no elaboration." Eleanor filed it and moved on. Mrs. Calder's granddaughter, her name was June. Eleanor had learned, 16 years old, with a burned scar on her right hand, that she'd been hiding under long sleeves since childhood, came to the ranch on a Saturday in November with her grandmother and, at Mrs. Calder's gentle insistence, with her sleeve rolled up. Eleanor sat with her at the kitchen table while Agnes produced tea and Nathaniel found reasons to be elsewhere, which was his particular form of useful sensitivity. "Your grandmother said you wanted to talk," Eleanor said. June looked at the table. Then, with the specific courage of someone doing something that cost them, "How do you not care about it?" Eleanor looked at the scar on her own face, the familiar geography of it. "I do care about it," she said. "That's not the thing that changed." "Then what changed?" "I stopped making it the most important thing in the room," Eleanor said. "Other people made it the most important thing for a long time. I let them, then I stopped letting them." She paused. "It took a while. It wasn't one decision. It was a lot of small ones." June was quiet. "Does it still hurt?" she said, "when people look?" "Sometimes," Eleanor said honestly, "less than it used to. Because I have more things to think about now than whether someone's looking correctly." June turned her scar on the table, looking at it the way you look at something you've been in conflict with for so long you don't remember what peace with it feels like. "What kinds of things?" she said. "Supply contracts," Eleanor said. "Fence routing, how to build operations that don't break under pressure." She paused. "People worth helping." June looked at her. "I want to learn accounts," June said. "My grandmother says I have a head for figures. But my father says it's not." She stopped. "Not what women do," Eleanor said. "Something like that." Eleanor looked at her steadily. "I'll teach you," she said. "Come on Saturdays. We'll start with ledger basics and go from there." June blinked. "Truly," Eleanor said. "Bring a notebook." Mrs. Calder, who had impeccable hearing and had been standing in the hallway for the last 3 minutes, came into the kitchen and poured herself tea without being invited, which was the prerogative of a woman who had outlasted everyone else's opinion of what she was allowed to do. "I told you," she said to June. June looked at her grandmother, then at Eleanor. Then, for the first time since she'd arrived, she smiled. It was young, and a little uncertain but completely real. Nathaniel appeared in the kitchen doorway at that precise moment, coffee cup in hand, assessed the scene, looked at Eleanor, and said nothing at all. He didn't need to. Eleanor looked back at him, across the kitchen, across this place that was theirs, this life that had been built from something that was meant to be a humiliation and had become, by the specific alchemy of refusing to accept other people's limits, something entirely else. She had arrived in Silver Creek Valley as a joke. She had arrived as a disposal. She had arrived as the ugly Whitfield girl, the burden, the one nobody wanted to show at social gatherings, the woman whose scar announced her before her voice could. And she had become, without performing a single moment of it, without asking permission for any of it, exactly who she had always been when no one was paying enough attention to see. The thing she had always known about herself, the thing that Providence, with all its elegant cruelty, had never managed to take the knowledge that she was capable, and real, and worth exactly what she had to offer, had not needed this place to create it. It had only needed this place to finally have somewhere to go. June came every Saturday. She arrived on time, which Eleanor noted approvingly on the first morning and continued to note because consistency was a form of character, and June had it in abundance. She brought a notebook, as instructed, and then a second one, when the first filled up, and then eventually a leather-bound ledger she'd bought with her own money from the dry goods store in town, which was the action of someone who has decided they are serious about a thing. She was serious. She had, as Mrs. Calder had said, a head for figures. But more than that, she had the particular kind of mind that understood what figures meant, that could hold a number and ask the right question about where it came from and what it implied. Eleanor recognized it because it was the same quality that had kept her sane in a Providence house where no one wanted her attention directed anywhere useful. The mind that insists on understanding, even when understanding is inconvenient. By the fourth Saturday, Eleanor had moved her past ledger basics into cost comparison structures. By the 8th, June was identifying pricing irregularities in sample records. Eleanor instructed for the purpose with the speed of someone who'd been doing it for years. "You have a gift," Eleanor said one morning, setting down a corrected worksheet. June looked at the paper with the careful expression of someone receiving a compliment. "They don't know whether to trust. My father says women who spend too much time with figures get ideas." "Your father is right," Eleanor said. "The ideas are the point." June looked up. "Ideas about what?" she said. "About what's possible," Eleanor said. "About what you could build. About what you're worth doing." She paused. "Have you thought about what you want to do?" "I want to manage my family's operations someday," June said. "The way you manage this one." A pause. "Father thinks my brother should do it." "What does your brother think?" June's expression shifted something between exasperated and fond. "He wants to go to California. He's been wanting to go to California since he was 12. He just hasn't told my father yet." "Then there may be an opening," Eleanor said. "You make it sound simple," June said. "It's not simple," Eleanor said. "It's just possible. Those are different things." Outside, they heard horses in the yard, more than the usual ranch traffic, and moving with the particular urgency that Eleanor had learned to distinguish from ordinary activity. She and June both looked up at the same moment. Harris's voice, sharp and direct, cut through the yard noise. Eleanor was on her feet before she consciously decided to move. She came out onto the porch to find 3 riders she didn't recognize, and Harris in conversation with them, his posture carrying the specific tension of a man receiving news he doesn't welcome. Nathaniel was coming from the direction of the barn at a pace that told her he'd already been flagged. "What is it?" Eleanor said. Harris turned. "Rider from the Aldrich office in Helena," he said. "There's a situation." One of the 3 men stepped forward, mid-30s, travel-worn, with the direct manner of someone used to delivering information that required action. "Mrs. Carter?" "James Preble, from Commissioner Aldrich's office. We have a problem in the Clearwater Valley, 40 miles east. 2 ranches went under last month. 3rd one's on the edge." He paused. "The pattern matches exactly what you documented with the Whitmore operation." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Who's running it this time?" "A man named Sorrell, land speculator out of Cheyenne." "He's..." Preble paused. "More sophisticated than Whitmore. He came with lawyers already in place, a contracted surveyor, and what looks like a corrupted county clerk." He held out a document. "Commissioner Aldrich is formally requesting your consultation." He says. Preble looked at the paper. He says, and I'm quoting, "Mrs. Carter is the only person in the territory who has successfully dismantled this specific type of operation from the inside. We need her in Clearwater within the week." The yard was very quiet. Eleanor took the document. "Read it." Nathaniel came to stand beside her without being asked, read it over her shoulder, said nothing. June was standing on the porch edge with wide eyes and an expression that was trying very hard to be composed. "Tell Commissioner Aldrich I'll be in Clearwater by Thursday," Eleanor said. Preble nodded. "He'll be relieved." "I'll need the full file on Sorrell's operation," Eleanor said. "Whatever your office has, send it ahead if you can." "Already dispatched," Preble said. "It'll be waiting at the Clearwater post office." After the riders left, Harris said, "I'll start on travel arrangements." "I'll need 2 days of preparation," Eleanor said. "And I want copies of the Whitmore documentation, to bring the pattern analysis specifically." "I can copy them," June said from the porch. Eleanor turned. June was standing there with her notebook already open, her scarred hand holding her pen, her posture carrying something that hadn't been there when she'd first arrived 8 weeks ago. Not confidence exactly, not yet, but the early architecture of it. The beginning of a person who has discovered she has things to offer. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I'd like that." Nathaniel waited until everyone had dispersed with their tasks before he came to stand beside Eleanor in the quiet that followed. 2 operations, he said. You dismantled one. Now you're going to dismantle another one. Try, Eleanor said. I'm going to try. You'll manage it, he said. You don't know that I know you, he said. She looked at him. The morning light was doing what Montana morning light did, that particular quality she'd stopped taking for granted. The openness of it, the way it came in sideways and lit everything without apology. I'll be back by the following week, she said. 10 days at most. I know, he said. Harris and I will hold things here. The Eastern Fence Project, Eleanor. His voice was warm but specific. Go, we'll be here when you come back. She looked at him for a moment. Then she did something she'd been doing more easily with practice. She let herself lean into him briefly. Just the weight of her head against his shoulder for 3 seconds. And he put his arm around her, without making it into a thing, without commentary, simply present. I'll miss this, she said. The ranch, the morning. The ranch will miss you, he said. Agnes will claim otherwise. Don't believe her. Eleanor laughed, which was also something she'd been doing more easily with practice. She left Thursday morning before sunrise. The Clearwater Valley situation was worse than Preble's summary had indicated, which Eleanor had expected because summaries always compressed the human cost into operational language, and the operational language never fully conveyed the weight of what it meant when people lost the land they'd worked for 20 years. 2 families already gone. A third, the Mercer family, husband and wife in their 60s, 2 adult sons who'd grown up on the property, holding on by the specific stubbornness of people who haven't run out a fight yet, but can feel the edge approaching. Eleanor met with the Mercers on her first afternoon in Clearwater. Thomas Mercer was a big man gone quiet, in the way of people who've been holding fear for long enough that the holding has become exhausting. His wife Ruth sat at the kitchen table across from Eleanor and said almost nothing during the first meeting, just watched with the careful, measuring attention of a woman who had learned not to trust promises. Eleanor did not make promises, she said. I'm going to look at your records. Everything you have: contracts, invoices, correspondence, deed documentation. If Sorrel is using the same methods that were used in Silver Creek Valley, there will be a pattern in the paperwork. The truth. Patterns can be proven. Proven patterns can be stopped. Thomas said. People have been looking at our records for 3 months. The county assessor, a lawyer we hired. Nobody found anything. What were they looking for? Eleanor said. Thomas looked at her. Fraud. Evidence of manipulation. Were they looking at the supplier relationship specifically? She said. The subcontracting chain? The personnel changes in the 6 months before the trouble started. A pause. I don't know, Thomas said. Then they weren't looking for the right things, Eleanor said. May I start? Ruth Mercer spoke for the first time. What did you say your name was? Eleanor Carter. Carter. Ruth turned the name over from Silver Creek. Yes, we heard about what happened there, Ruth said. Heard a woman figured it out. Her eyes moved to Eleanor's face, the scar, the familiar track of another person's first moment of processing, and then past it, in the quick, decisive way of someone who has decided to prioritize what matters. That was you? That was several people, Eleanor said. I contributed. Ruth looked at her husband. Something passed between them, the compressed communication of long marriage, meaning moving without words. Start wherever you need to, Ruth said to Eleanor. We'll get you whatever you ask for. It took Eleanor 4 days to find it. Sorrel was, as Preble had said, more sophisticated than Whitmore. He hadn't used a single corrupted employee, he'd used 3, placed across an 18-month period, each one appearing independent of the others. The supplier manipulation was layered through a legitimate contracting company that had no visible connection to Sorrel's interests, until you looked at the secondary's ownership structure, which required following 4 company names through 2 territorial registration systems before the common ownership surfaced. Eleanor found it at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, alone in the Clearwater post office where Commissioner Aldrich's liaison had set up a working space for her. She sat with the company registration documents spread across the table and traced the ownership chain with her finger and felt the specific, quiet satisfaction of a pattern completing itself. She sent a wire to Commissioner Aldrich at midnight. His response came at 7 the next morning, confirmed. Federal jurisdiction, triggered by interstate company fraud. U.S. Marshal's Office notified. Sorrel to be served by Monday. Extraordinary work, Aldrich. She sent a second wire. To Nathaniel, it said found it. Coming home Sunday. His reply arrived 2 hours later. Good. Agnes made pie. She smiled at the wire for a moment before she folded it. Then she went to the Mercer property and told them. Thomas Mercer sat very still for a long time after she finished explaining. His wife Ruth pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at Eleanor with an expression that had moved past gratitude into something that didn't have a clean name, the complicated feeling of a person who has been close enough to losing. Everything that having it back doesn't feel entirely real yet. He's going to be arrested, Thomas said. Charged, Eleanor said. The arrest depends on the federal process, but the fraud documentation is solid. The county clerk connection will be investigated separately, that's the territorial office's jurisdiction, and Commissioner Aldrich is already moving on it. The other families, Ruth said, the ones who already sold. Dawson and the Henrys. The sales may be contestable if the fraud influenced the circumstances that forced the sale, Eleanor said. That's a legal process and it's not guaranteed, but it can be started. I'd suggest you contact Ruth Kavanaugh in Billings. She wrote the name on a piece of paper. She handled the legal aspect of the Silver Creek situation. She's the best person to advise on the recovery options. Ruth took the paper, looked at it, then looked up at Eleanor. Why did you come here, she said. You have your own ranch. Your own life. You didn't have to. Eleanor considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything. Because someone needed to, she said, and I knew how. She paused. When you know how to do something that helps people and you don't do it, that's a kind of waste I find hard to justify. Ruth Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Stay for dinner, she said. It's not a request. Eleanor stayed for dinner. She rode back to Silver Creek on Sunday, and the landscape that had been strange and enormous to her on the train ride out, 8 months prior, more than 8 months now, closer to a year. The year that had remade everything felt like something else now. Not familiar the way Providence had been familiar. The wearying familiarity of a place you know too well and have outgrown. Familiar the way a choice feels familiar, the specific warmth of a place you picked. Nathaniel met her at the station. He was there when the horse came in, standing in the specific unhurried way he stood, and when she came down he looked at her with the expression she had built her life. Inside the one that said, there you are, exactly as I expected, exactly right. Pie's at the ranch, he said. Agnes saved it? She said she'd throw it out if you weren't back by Monday, he said. She won't, but she said it. Eleanor took his arm and they walked toward the horses and she thought this exact configuration. This is what I came here for, and more than I knew I was coming for, and everything I would choose again, without changing a single step of how it happened. The ranch in November had a different texture than it had in spring when she'd arrived colder, the work adjusted to the season, the hands moving, with the particular efficiency of people who know the schedule by instinct. Harris met her in the yard with the operational update she hadn't asked for, but was grateful to receive everything in order, the Eastern Fence project on schedule, the new supply contract delivering correctly. Billy promoted to junior foreman on a trial basis that Harris reported with the compressed satisfaction of someone whose recommendation had proven accurate. How'd he do? Eleanor asked. Didn't panic once, Harris said. Even when the northwest waterline froze, and we had to move 60 head in the dark. Good, Eleanor said. Make it permanent. Harris looked at her. Nathaniel's call. I know, Eleanor said, recommending it. Make it permanent. Harris nodded once, which was as close as he got to enthusiastic agreement. Agnes met her at the kitchen door with pie already sliced and the specific expression of a woman who had been right about something and didn't need to say so, because being right was sufficient. Eat, Agnes said. You look like you didn't sleep. I slept adequately, Eleanor said. That means not enough, Agnes said. Eat. Eleanor sat down and ate Agnes's pie and listened to the ranch house come back into focus around her, the sounds and rhythms of it, the specific texture of a place that was hers in the deepest sense. Not by inheritance or obligation, but by choice and work, and the daily accumulation of everything she'd built here. June arrived the following Saturday with 3 pages of questions she'd written in her notebook during Eleanor's absence. She'd continued working through the ledger exercises on her own, which Eleanor had not suggested, but found she'd expected anyway. "I found something in my father's equipment contracts," June said, sitting across from Eleanor with her notebook open and her scarred hand holding her pen without the sleeve pulled down to cover it, which she'd stopped doing sometime around week 6 and hadn't mentioned, and Eleanor hadn't remarked upon. "The pricing on the harvest equipment lease, it didn't match the standard rate I calculated from the reference figures you gave me." Eleanor looked at the paper June slid across the table. The discrepancy was small, $63 over 2 years. Not Whitmore scale, probably an honest supplier error rather than deliberate fraud. But June had found it, and she'd found it because she'd learned to look. "What did you do with this?" Eleanor said. "I wrote it down," June said. "I wasn't sure if I should show my father without knowing if I was right." "You're right," Eleanor said. "The math is correct, and the discrepancy is real." "Is it fraud?" "Probably not," Eleanor said. "Probably a billing error. But it needs to be corrected either way." "How do I tell him?" June said. "He doesn't. He's not always." She stopped. "He doesn't think I should be doing this." Eleanor looked at her. "How do you feel about that?" "I feel like I found a $63 error that nobody else caught," June said, with the quiet precision of someone who has located the core of something. "Then you already have your answer," Eleanor said. "Show him the paper. Show him your math. Don't apologize for knowing what you know." She paused. "If he dismisses it without looking at the figures, write to me. I'll come." June's eyes widened slightly. "You'd come to my house for this?" "For $63, and a girl who knows how to find it," Eleanor said. "Yes, absolutely." June looked at her notebook, then up at Eleanor. "Why do you do this?" she said. "The Clearwater thing. The Valley summaries, teaching me." She paused. "You don't have to." "No," Eleanor agreed. "Then why?" Eleanor thought about it the way she thought about things that mattered, not quickly, not with the convenience of a ready answer, but with the actual attention the question deserved. "Because I spent 27 years in a house where no one looked at me," she said. "And then I came here, and someone looked, and everything changed." She paused. "When you know what it costs to be seen, and you have the ability to help someone else be seen, you do it. Because someone did it for you, or because you know what it meant when they didn't." June was quiet for a long moment. "Mrs. Carter," she said, "I want to do what you do someday, the consulting, the pattern work, the going where the problem is and finding it." "I know," Eleanor said. "You knew?" "Since about the 4th Saturday," Eleanor said. "Keep learning. When you're ready, I'll take you with me on a case." June made a sound that was trying to be composed and not entirely succeeding. The winter came down hard on Silver Creek Valley that year, the kind of cold that tests the decisions you made in autumn, whether you prepared correctly, whether you held enough reserve, whether the choices made in warmer conditions hold up under pressure. The Carter operation held well. The supply contracts were solid. The fence rerouting was complete before the freeze. The herd was healthy and accounted for. 2 letters arrived in December. The first was from Commissioner Aldrich in Helena. Sorrell had been charged by the federal court. The county clerk connected to his operation had resigned and was under investigation. One of the 2 families who'd sold the Dawsons had grounds for legal contest of their sale, and Ruth Kavanaugh had filed the initial documents. The recovery wasn't guaranteed, but it was possible, and possible was the word Eleanor had learned to build on. Aldrich's letter ended, "Your contribution to this territory is considerable and growing. I hope you know that, A." She read it twice and set it on the desk and went back to work. The second letter was from Clara. It was longer than Clara's previous letters, 5 pages, written in the quick, looping hand that Eleanor had always associated with her sister's particular style of thinking, fast and associative. Ideas connecting before she'd finished the sentence before. Clara had, apparently, had a conversation with Frederick. Several conversations. The letter was candid in a way that Clara's previous writing had not been, not performed candor, but actual honesty, which Eleanor suspected was new to the practice. Frederick had agreed to make changes. Clara was uncertain whether the changes would hold. She was more uncertain about whether holding was enough, or whether she needed something fundamental than change, which was a different question, and one she was apparently beginning to ask herself. She ended with, "You told me to decide what I wanted." "I'm still deciding. I'll write when I know." See, Eleanor wrote back, "Take the time you need. I'm here, E." She sealed the letter and set it with the outgoing post, and thought about her sister, not with the old weight of the old wound, which had genuinely lightened over the months, but with the specific, honest care of a person who has decided to be present for a family member who is finding their way slowly. Not unconditional acceptance of everything, not erasure of what had happened. Just presence. Just the door left open. On a Saturday in January, Nathaniel came into the office where Eleanor was working on the quarterly account review and sat down across from her without his usual agenda. She recognized the quality of the silence. She set her pen down. "What?" she said. He looked at her. "I want to tell you something." "All right. When I sent those letters to Providence," he said, "I thought I was looking for companionship. Someone to share the ranch with, someone to make the house less quiet." He paused. "I thought that's what I needed. And now," Eleanor said, "and now I think what I actually needed was someone who made me better at what I do," he said. "Someone who saw the things I missed. Someone who." He paused. "This ranch is more than it was, not because of money or the contracts or the legal thing. Because the decisions are better. Because there's someone in this with me who's actually in it." Eleanor looked at him. "You would have gotten there without me," she said. "Maybe," he said, slower. With more mistakes, he looked at her directly. "I'm not telling you this because you need to hear it. I'm telling you because it's true, and you deserve to know it's true." Eleanor held that for a moment. "Your letters found me," she said. "In the worst house I've ever lived in. At a table where I sorted other people's mail because no one thought to tell me to stop." She paused. "I read them, and I thought this man is looking for something real. And I wanted to be real for someone." She met his eyes. "You gave me that, before I knew what you were giving me." The ranch house was quiet around them. Outside, Silver Creek Valley was conducting itself in the enormous, patient way of a landscape that has no investment in human drama, and continues regardless the cold and the cattle, and the work, and the daily reality of a place that demanded presence and rewarded it with the specific dignity of having built something that stood. Inside, two people sat across from each other at a desk covered in account books and supply contracts and a 5-year operational projection, and 11 copied letters in a wooden box on the shelf. And the sum of what they'd built was not separate from the numbers and the paperwork and the solved problems. It was made of those things. It was the result of seeing clearly and working hard and refusing, over and over, to accept other people's definitions of what was possible. Harris knocked and came in with the afternoon supply count without ceremony. He set the report on the corner of the desk, looked at both of them with the comprehensive assessment of a man who'd been reading rooms for 30 years, and said, "The northeast herds settled. Temperature held overnight. We're good." "Thank you, Harris," Eleanor said. He nodded. Started to leave, stopped at the door, said without turning, "You know what I heard in town last week?" "What?" Nathaniel said. "Man at the feed store was talking about the Clearwater operation. How Sorrel got caught, how it fell apart." Harris paused. He said he'd heard it was a woman who figured it out. He said it was the most impressive thing he'd seen in 20 years of watching territorial business. Silence. "Did he know?" said. "He did," Harris said. "He said her name." He turned then and looked at Eleanor with the expression she'd come to know as his most unguarded one, the one that came through when he'd stopped managing what he showed. "He said it right too." He left. Nathaniel looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at the account book in front of her, and the letter from Aldrich on the corner of the desk, and the winter light coming through the window, and the life that had been built from what was meant to be a disposal, a joke, an act of cruelty dressed up as an arrangement. She picked up her pen. She went back to work, because that was what she did, not to prove anything to anyone who doubted her, not to answer the voices from Providence that had named her wrong for 27 years, but because the work mattered. And she was the person who knew how to do it, and that was enough. That had always been enough. It had just taken the right place, and the right person, and the particular kind of love that doesn't flinch at scars to show her that the worth she'd carried her entire life had never needed anyone's permission to be real. She had arrived in Silver Creek Valley as the woman they sent to fail. She left that identity at the station the day she stepped off the train, and she never went back for it. What she became instead was simply herself, Eleanor Carter, who kept the books and solved the problems and taught the girls with scarred hands that figures and courage and the refusal to be diminished were the most valuable things a person could carry into any room. And that was the whole of it. And it was more than enough, and it was hers.